All right, welcome everybody on this rainy day. Thank you guys for joining us. So welcome to Reading Between the Lines, a conversation with the AJC's Greg Bluestein and Grady's Professor Joe Watson. This event is sponsored by the Jim Kennedy Professors of New Media, the Carolyn Tieger Chair in Public Affairs Communication that Professor Watson holds, and the Carolyn McKenzie and Donnie Carter Chair for Excellence in Journalism that Dr. Hume holds. Bringing together journalism and public relations for a timely discussion of political communication. We'd especially like to welcome Dr. Audrey Haynes, Media and Politics class. Yay, Dr. Haynes. And Dr. Karen Russell's PR Campaigns class from Grady. Shout out to you guys too, PR Campaigns. My name is Bart Wojcinski. I'm just going to introduce the speakers and then get out of the way. And then Dr. Watson is going to sort of lead our discussion in Q&A. And then I think at the end, Dr. Russell is going to moderate some questions from you guys as well. So if you have questions, sit tight on those because we'll definitely try to leave a lot of time for that in the event. All right, so our speakers. Greg Bluestein has been a political reporter for the AJC since 2012, where he primarily covers the governor's office and the state house. After receiving his ABJ from some place called the Grady College, Grady College, wherever that is. In 2004, Bluestein also worked for the Savannah Morning News, Fulton Daily Report, and then for 7 years at the AP. In 2014, Bluestein received the John E. Drury Young Alumni Award from the Grady College. He's also excelled in the public engagement arena as a reporter, staying connected with his audience on Twitter, where he's got almost 25,000 followers, doing a bunch of Reddit AMAs, kind of shedding some transparency about the process and answering other questions that might not fit into his article. So public engagement's kind of always at the forefront of the stuff he's done. Professor Joe Watson is the inaugural Carolyn Tieger Professor of Public Affairs Communication here at Grady. Prior to coming here in 2017, he had a distinguished career in public affairs communication. He worked as legislative counsel and then legislative director for U.S. Senator Peter G. Fitzgerald, worked as an associate administrator at the U.S. Department of Commerce, and then spent 12 years working for Exelon, the largest energy company in the U.S. by revenue, as director of federal government affairs and then director of public advocacy. So please welcome both Greg and Joe. And now I'll turn the floor over to Professor Watson.
Thanks very much, Bart. Appreciate that introduction. Greg, it's good to be here with you this morning.
Thanks for having me.
When Dr. Russell approached me about this, I was really intrigued with the idea of having this discussion this morning because for lay people that either are not journalists or not media relations practitioners, there's kind of a lot of jargon and language that goes into writing and covering and reporting and everything else. And if you're not conversant in it, it's quite possible to get yourself into some bad situations. And so I wanted to read something for you this morning to kind of kick off our discussion. And I'm going to read.
This is a surprise to
this,
me.
This is a surprise. We like surprises. I'm going to read a piece from the New Yorker. My wife is going to laugh if she ever watches or hears this because I'm not a New Yorker reader, so for me to read the New Yorker is kind of funny. And the article is entitled, Anthony Scaramucci Called Me to Unload About White House Leakers, Reince Priebus, and Steve Bannon. I'm just going to read you the start of the piece, and then I'll lead in the question, but it's kind of worth it. It's a fun payoff. On Wednesday night, I received a phone call from Anthony Scaramucci, the new White House communications director. He wasn't happy. Earlier in the night, I tweeted citing a, quote, senior White House official, close quote, that Scaramucci was having dinner at the White House with President Trump, the First Lady Sean Hannity, and the former Fox News executive Bill Shine. It was an interesting group and raised some questions. Was Trump getting strategic advice from Hannity? Was he considering hiring Shine? But Scaramucci had his own question for me. Who leaked that to you, he asked. I said I couldn't give him that information. He responded by threatening to fire the entire White House communications staff. What I'm going to do is I will eliminate everyone in the comms team and we'll start over, he said. I laughed, not sure if he really believed that such a threat would convince a journalist to reveal a source. He continued to press me and complain that the staff he's inherited in his new job. I asked these guys not to leak anything and they can't help themselves, he said. You're an American citizen. This is a major catastrophe for the American country. So I'm asking you as an American patriot to give me a sense of who leaked it. Then it goes on. I'm going to skip over a little bit of this and note this part. Scaramucci's first public appearance as comms director was a slick and conciliatory performance at the lectern in the White House briefing room last Friday. He suggested it was time for the White House to turn a page, but since then he's become obsessed with leaks and threatened to fire staffers if he discovers that they have given unauthorized information to reporters. Michael Short, a White House press aide considered close to Priebus, resigned on Tuesday after Scaramucci publicly spoke about firing him. Meanwhile, several damaging stories about Scaramucci have appeared in the press, and he blamed Priebus for most of them. And this is the part that what we're going to close with. Now he wanted to know whom I had been talking to about his dinner with the president. Scaramucci, who initiated the call, did not ask for the conversation to be off the record or on background.
Whoops.
So, do you recall, Greg, how long Mr. Scaramucci served as White House comms director?
2017 seems so long ago, doesn't it? He was comms director for maybe like 2 weeks, was it?
11 days.
11 days.
11 days. 2 weeks would have been nice, but 11 days is
Almost there.
Almost there. I raised this really to start our conversation about some of the terms of art there, because as a practitioner, I remember as a young congressional staffer, the comms director at the time asked me to speak to a reporter. I was an energy lawyer, I worked on energy policy. He's like, would you speak to a reporter on deep background about this? And I said, sure. And I was so nervous that what I said was going to be reported that I kind of said, this is on deep background. And he's like, yes, the journalist said yes. And I would speak for about a paragraph, and then I'd say, this is on background, because I was terrified I would actually be reported, you know. But not the case with Mr. Scaramucci. And I raise this because there are a lot of people. Mr. Scaramucci, I think, is estimated to be worth around $200 million. He's a graduate of the Harvard Law School. He attended Harvard Law School with, at the same time that Barack Obama and Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch did. But yet he makes something that is virtually a rookie mistake.
Yeah.
What's your impression of all this?
Well, first of all, a lot of what we do as reporters and what public relations professionals do is about relationship building. So most of the people I work with, and there are 5 or 6 PR folks who I joke with about as much as I talk with my wife, right? I tell my wife that and she gets upset. But I talk with these folks 5 times a day sometimes. So a lot of it's about relationship building and people who I've known who have been in this field for a long time. So there's always that calculus that you as a reporter can sort of weigh, because with my sources, there's an unwritten sort of agreement that when they text, when they call me, it is on background or even off the record if they state it so, and nothing is reportable. But at the same time, you know, in this case with Scaramucci, he's probably dealing with a dozen reporters every hour, and he might not have had that same understanding. For me, it's invaluable to get a behind-the-scenes look at what's going on in, let's say, the governor's office or a congressional race or a Senate race or whatever, to have that relationship where I can hear things without having to necessarily report them. Boy, do I try to report them sometimes, right? I try to get other sources to confirm or to get my source comfortable enough to go on background with me on certain things. But it's also, you know, it's very different working in Washington than working in the Atlanta State House, because the people who I deal with every day are people I'm dealing with for years and years and years at a time, right? And some of them are going to be in this room. Cody Hall is the governor's chief spokesman. 3 years ago, he was a Grady senior. So it shows you how quickly, especially in the world of Georgia politics, certainly national politics, you can rise quickly, but in Georgia politics, it can be real quick. Jim Galloway, my colleague, whenever he comes to speak to classes here, he always puts in a compliment to Grady at the end, because he goes, I might be working with you guys one day. And that's very, very true, that, you know, 2 years down the road, we might be talking all the time about some candidate on a daily basis, like I am with the 5 or 6 PR folks who I just mentioned. So there's a give and take with these relationships. There's only been 2 PR people who I have ever kind of burned forever and just won't talk to, and because they've done kind of unspeakable things and betrayed trust. But for the most part, the other 99.999%, I have a familiar relationship with, and wouldn't go that route with them unless it's clearly stated. I still have candidates and Congress members. There's one Congress member who says every time they call me, says, it's off the record, it's off the record. I'm like, yeah, you know, it's off the record. Like, you know, you're calling me, I'm not the one pumping you for information. But every reporter does have those different standards. And so a lot of the job is for you guys to know where that reporter stands, and to also make sure you say that off the record before, because not everyone is like me, and not everyone could do that. And there's certainly been times too, and it's stuff I've wrestled with, where a candidate calls me out of the blue and just unloads and never said that off the record thing. And I was like, I could just, I could write a story about this right now. And there's a debate, and I talk to my editors about it, or I go through my own internal calculus. I'm like, well, I probably am too forgiving on that kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's important. I mean, let's kind of walk through and define some of the more common terms. And so when you say something is there's off the record, there's also on background, there's deep background, there's not for attribution. There's a lot of language there.
There's a lot of Venn diagram overlapping there.
And I'd like you to get your thoughts on that. But a lot of it also, I think, is a bit of a negotiation between the journalist and the party there. And I think it comes back to the relationship point there. I mean, do you think it's possible to really navigate this well without having some kind of a relationship with a person?
Very hard. And it's not to say impossible, because all of you guys will have to be in that role where you don't have a relationship with a reporter. You're dealing with someone, a national reporter or a local, whoever it might be, who's sort of, you're new to the beat and they're new to the beat. So it happens. But having that relationship and having that FaceTime and getting to know that person, even over coffee, I'm doing one after this at 3 o'clock at the Dunwoody Alons, 4 o'clock at the Dunwoody Alons with a Washington PR person. So I do it all the time so that they can see that I'm a human being and that I can see that they're a human being. Because look, it goes a long way, right? We're not just faceless reporters out there typing in our underwear behind a computer screen. We're real people who have a stake in this community. We're not mercenaries. We live and work and raise children and vote in these communities too. And so do the PR people. And they have a job to do, and we get it. And sometimes they have a job to do for a candidate who is horrible, who makes all sorts of mistakes, who can't help him or herself. And they still have to do their damnedest. And we understand that as a reporter too. But it's real hard to do that job without that groundwork and without any sort of understanding. And the definitions vary of what off the record and on background and all that mean. To me, off the record is not for reporting at all. And I don't even like to go off the record that much because I hate knowing it in the back of my head. But sometimes it is helpful, and I'll give you an example. Just the other day, none of these are huge bombshells, but the other day, a candidate suddenly canceled an event, and it seemed very curious to me. And one of his opponents mentioned it and said, "Wow, this is bizarre." And they're tracking Facebook and Twitter in a way that I'm not, and so they found it before I did. And so I asked the candidate about that. And I got the off-the-record understanding of why. And I completely understand why he would cancel the event, because it makes 100% sense for his campaign to do it. But I also don't have anything on the record to say why. And to me, it's not a story, but at least I could go back and say, okay, I get why they canceled this event. It's not a front page story. It's not even a blog story for the Political Insider blog that I help curate every day. But it gives me an understanding. Background to me, and again, this depends on the reporter, but the general understanding of background is not for attribution, is someone who is giving you details that you are allowed to report as long as it sticks with your ethical and your publication standards, and that varies too.
So Greg, this is the kind of thing that you might see as, a party familiar with the situation, or a senior official.
A senior official. And then for reporters, it depends on how their outlet's comfortable with it. There are some outlets that say no anonymous sources whatsoever. Ours has a pretty high standard. We have to show a compelling reason why we use an anonymous source. We can't just use it for, let's say a smear attack. So-and-so is insulting so-and-so. We can't use it for that. What I tend to use those most for, honestly, is economic development deals. State Farm's building a giant complex in Atlanta that's going to create 20,000 new jobs, according to 2 senior advisors. I also use it to get to the stories behind the stories. I use it to get to the why. The other day, Lieutenant Governor Jeff Duncan's top aide suddenly resigned like that, and it was very surprising. So I wrote the story that he resigned, and speculated a little in the story because it came right after Kelly Leffler was announced as the new U.S. Senator. But then like a day or a couple of days later, I wrote the real story. But I had to get the real story using anonymous sources. And everyone checked out the real story. I went to the Lieutenant Governor's office, and they verified a lot of the main facts in that story. So I did my homework. I wasn't just going to do a one-sided piece about this type of thing. But I used anonymous sources for that because those sources that were involved in that very dicey personnel decision couldn't go on the record. And then there's like deep background where you have to be very even more opaque about, you can't even say senior, Kemp aides. You have to say something like, according to a top Republican who has knowledge of the situation. And so it gets a little bit, I tend to stick with the whole background thing, if at all possible. But there's some situations where there's a giant story and you've got to break it, right? Or you've had incredible pressure to break it. And a couple of them just were recently with Kelly Leffler being appointed U.S. Senator. I had reported back in November that she was likely the U.S. Senator. She had applied with Brian Kemp on the online application. I don't know if you guys were paying attention to all that drama, but there was an online process, like an online resume process. So the moment she applied, I knew that she was probably going to be in, and I had sources telling me she was probably going to be in, but who weren't 100% sure. And so I spent my Thanksgiving break just hounding people in the know from Washington and in Atlanta and around the governor's office and everyone I could find. A lot to no luck, and finally I got some luck just to confirm what we kind of all knew, which was she was going to be the next U.S. Senator, but had to go with, I think it ended up being 6, on background sources who were various levels of being close to Governor Kemp or having direct knowledge of the situation.
In a conversation, have you experienced, starting a conversation on the record, but then also saying, someone gets to an area and they say, can I go off the record on this point? And give some explication, then coming back.
We have had that situation. Where we have that situation the most is, this is bizarre, but op-ed meetings in our newsroom. We have op-ed meetings where our editorial editor immediately says, this is all on the record, so just so you know, you with permission, you can ask to go off the record, but this is all on the record. And they've been dicey meetings, right? I mean, one of them was involving Mayor Kasim Reed, the former Atlanta mayor, who's many of his senior advisors have now been indicted on varying levels of corruption charges. Some of them have been governors, some of them have been candidates. Stacey Abrams was in there. And so I can't remember if she went off the record. But sometimes they do, and sometimes they just want to give us a clearer understanding as a reporter, the context that we need. And that's fine with me. And sometimes they want to go into legal issues and personal issues too. And to the most part, that's fine with me too. Although, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes it's a struggle because, you don't want to be in the position, you always know a little bit more than your reader, but you don't want to know a tremendous amount more than your reader because you want to let the readers know, get insight on what you're covering. So you don't want to look like you're holding your cards back. Although there are some things where you just, that are unverified, where you're in that weird position where you have to hold back a little.
Is there a presumption that when you're in a conversation with a reporter and you are a public official that you're on the record unless the language has been suggested otherwise?
Yeah, there is that presumption. Unless you have that relationship, and I tell people, honestly, a lot of what I do now is text-based, which is weird because 10, 15 years ago, I'd never imagined that. But now, I text back and forth with 20, 30 people a day on your average day, not even a day where things are breaking or crazy. And I usually tell, especially news sources, that, hey, this is off the record unless we say otherwise, because I want to have that back channel.
Yeah.
A lot of my job is going around you guys, PR professionals. And I understand the necessity to go through PR professionals for a lot of stories, but I also love having that back channel with candidates. And it's weird for us as political reporters because let's take Stacey Abrams and Brian Kemp. Brian Kemp, I covered Brian Kemp's state senate run in 2002 at the Red and Black. I was in Charles Bullock's class and I sat next to one of his top advisors. It's weird thinking about that. And back then he was more of like a moderate Republican running on a campaign to get more funding for UGA. And he beat the incumbent Democratic Senator Doug Haynes. Stacey Abrams I've known since like 2009 or 10, and she was kind of a backbench, low profile Democrat before she became the minority leader of the House. These are folks, I've had their cell phone numbers, I've talked to them, routinely, long before they became, national superstar political figures. And so it's weird as a reporter, a hometown reporter per se, who suddenly has to go through not just 1 or 2 layers, but sometimes like multiple. It was Stacey Abrams. There's multiple layers now because she's such an international political figure now. So it's weird. I still have her number. We still text every so often, but there are layers now that we have to get used to as reporters, and that comes again and again and again because there's candidates right now in the same situation where they're state lawmakers who will in 4 years be same thing. They'll be on MSNBC every day. They'll be national figures. And so for me, it's about having that back channel with those candidates to be able to honestly say something like, hey, what's the deal with this? Just let me know why you decided to endorse so-and-so. You know, I've got your statement and I've got your story out, but I want to understand the real reasoning in a way that maybe I'd love for you to say it on the record, but I'd love to know off the record too. Like, why'd you just endorse Mike Bloomberg? Why'd you just do X, Y, Z? Why'd you decide not to run for that Senate race? And look, these guys know that a single stray remark will be used in an attack ad against them. These days, the Oppo research divisions are so much, and I don't know if you know what Oppo research is, but for those who don't, campaigns now have teams of researchers who dig into every single thing they've ever said or posted online or done that could be, or every vote they've made if they're in public office, that can be used against them. And they will use it against you. They will find anything and use it against you. It could be, for instance, this just happened. Doug Collins voted for a budget that he's a congressman from Gainesville who voted for a budget that the rest of Republican the Republican delegation voted for too. But one of his critics attacked him for voting for the budget because it included some money for the San Francisco Opera, and saying that Doug Collins is like Nancy Pelosi, which is the ultimate insult to a conservative.
And they worked
Republican.
AOC into the ad.
And they worked AOC into the ad too. So they'll find anything. And so as a reporter, I understand that A, my job is to get you to say, the truth, but B, like, I understand why candidates are so reluctant or officials are so reluctant to tell you something that could be thrown back out at them. That's why 2018 was so interesting, because you had both candidates, Kemp and Abrams, who were willing to say things that, especially with Abrams' case, that Democrats didn't say even like 2 years earlier, right? On, let's say, gun control, or on removing the Confederate faces for Stone Mountain, or on income equality, or all these issues the Democrats weren't comfortable talking about in a state like Georgia. They suddenly were. So it was kind of, in that sense, refreshing that she was just open and kind of transparent about it.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I'm going to put on my PR hat for a moment and kind of give you the other perspective on it, because the challenge is, when you're doing public relations, you want message discipline and message control. And so there's a wonderful folksy quality that some candidates may have, or even, chief executives of companies, but if you're in the role of a communications director, whether it's on a campaign for a government official or CEO, you want to control what they communicate, because you don't want them to have that spontaneous moment that is great for you, but it could take your organization or campaign off brand or off message in a significant way. And that's interesting. I mean, when you think about the relationship between journalists and public relations practitioners, there's a narrative, okay? And as a PR practitioner, I want to control that narrative, and I want to push a narrative that's my narrative, but you also have a narrative that you're working from. And so there's that back and forth tension there, but I would say I would get sick to my stomach sometimes when I would have a principal going out talking to a journalist, and I would say, under no circumstance do you initiate a call unless I'm in the room and I'm actually there recording it, just so I can confirm what's said, or if there's a quote that's there and you just were back and forth with Greg and I wasn't in the room, and that story comes up and he said, well, I didn't tell Greg that. Well, I'm like, well, Greg said you didn't. There's nobody else on the other side with any evidence to say you didn't.
And the fun part for me is that oftentimes the candidates do want to have that back channel too. They would love to, maybe not on the record per se, hopefully on the record for me, but maybe not. But they want to have that open line too, because they don't like being sometimes filtered or having to go through a layer to speak directly to a reporter they've had a relationship. Not necessarily a random reporter who just showed up, but a national reporter who we call it parachuting in, but someone who they've known for 15 years, and to be suddenly cut off. I'll give you this example. Jason Carter was Jimmy Carter's grandson and a law graduate here, and his wife, Kate Carter, was the editorial advisor at the Red and Black when I was the editor-in-chief of the Red and Black all through 2003 and 2004. And it was a weird position for me to be in, because flash forward 8 years later, 10 years later, I should say, and I was the AJC's political guy, and he was running for office. And I knew him, I didn't know him well, but I knew him well enough. I spent time with him here at UGA, and I knew his wife very well. But you have to kind of separate that. And it's a conversation I always have with candidates who I know. It's just like, there's going to be a time where you not only hate me, but like want to punch my face, right? There's going to be a time where you're furious with me, despite the fact that we might have known each other for a while and might have, had lunch together and coffee together and talked about this eventuality one day. Like, there's going to be plenty of times where you're furious with what I'm writing. And most of the times, the candidates get that. But Jason, we always kept sort of a back channel. I always was mindful that his PR spokesman wanted to be in the loop on things, so kept him in the loop. But there are certainly times where I would get texts from Jason, let's say about a poll, and say, hey, just so you know, like I saw your take on this poll, but here's my take. And it was helpful to me because I got to have an inner glimpse, kind of spin-free, of what the candidate was truly thinking about how they're feeling. And I'm not saying that's appropriate all the time, because Jason and I had a relationship, just like Governor Deal and I covered Governor Deal for years. So, when he would see me at events, he might pull me aside and tell me something offhand. So it's the same thing. You have to develop that sort of trust with the reporter to know that reporter is going to treat you fairly.
Yeah, and there are also pitfalls to that, because a lot of times there are individuals, you can become very comfortable, and I work with someone who was very comfortable as a small publication, and it was an op-ed meeting, divulged information prior to the actual beginning, prior to actually sitting at the table. Kind of had a conversation before everyone's sitting at the table, and you're thinking like, well, this is my hometown paper, nobody's sitting down, I'm just kind of like having a conversation, and then we sit down, and they reached out to the comms director and said, hey, at this meeting, this was divulged, and went back and said, well, wait a minute, we were not sitting down, but on the record, it's like, well, I've known you guys for years. Can I get that back? So I'm going to ask you a follow-up question, which is that are there mulligans with the press? I mean, do you get a do-over if you've divulged something and it's on the record and it's a significant story? Can you say, I want to? Let me get that back.
You mean after it's been reported?
No, after it's been articulated. But it's a significant story.
Not really. I mean, I can't imagine a scenario where there's a significant story that you said something on the record, and it was clearly on the record, and that you tried to pull it back. There are varying level degrees where, I've had situations where I've told, and I usually say this, by the way, I say, I'm reporting this out in case there's a story, if it's a sensitive issue. And the people who and there are some really sensitive issues that you report on, that reporters in their first year will have to tackle. Just marital infidelity and corruption and all sorts of things where you're dealing with like people's, not just their political careers, but their entire family's reputation, financial liabilities, all sorts of different things that come into play. And so as a reporter, you've got to keep that in mind, that you're not just dealing with like a random attack ad, but you're talking about like this guy's future or this woman's future. So at the same time, like I will say, I'm reporting this out just in case. It's not my call whether to run it, but I need to report it out. And this happened a lot with the Me Too movement, to be honest, where we reported some things and our editors decided with other things there wasn't enough evidence, there wasn't enough, I shouldn't say evidence, there wasn't enough there to report. And boy, if candidates and politicians got just furious that I even asked the question. But sometimes that's our job too, is just to ask that question, get them to respond, and then say like, we might report it, we might not, I'll let you know. Trust me, you will not find this on the Sunday front page, but it won't be a surprise to you if it runs. In those cases too, you're in a weird situation because you're dealing with, again, someone's entire future. But no, I wouldn't say that that once something is on the record, it's kind of is on the record.
Yeah, you don't get do-overs.
No.
You don't get do-overs. That's why the comms people, the PR people are so tight, because we realize if somebody commits an unforced error, you can't unring the bell. I want to ask you one other question, then I think with Dr. Russell's permission, we'll open it up so students can ask some questions and we can continue our conversation. But I also want to talk to you about this. I mean, one of the reasons, Greg, that you're so respected and you have such a substantial following is you break so many stories and such high profile, both Georgia and national stories. And I imagine, given your stature and given your role, you get pitched a great deal. And I'd like to talk a little bit, my closing questions, about pitching and about exclusives, embargoes. If you can kind of walk the audience through a little bit in terms of, how you regard those differently, because obviously PR practitioners, they come to you with an exclusive, they have something in mind, et cetera, and how do you treat that and regard that?
So I'm a huge fan of the embargo because I love posting things at 6 a.m. on the mornings.
So
because,
let's tell them what an embargo is first. So an embargo, if someone offers you something on an embargo basis, they basically say, you have this, but you're not permitted to report on it until a set time.
I'll give a great example.
Yeah.
Trey Hood, a UGA political science professor who does polling for us, but just yesterday he decided to do a free poll. Like, we didn't have to pay him, it was great. I guess he was using his polling unit and keeping them kind of fresh. And so he did this big poll on a bunch of things, including of all, Trump standing and Kemp's agenda and Kelly Leffler. But he also asked what Georgia's preferred chicken sandwich is. Anyone have a guess of what Georgians like as their favorite? Chick-fil-A. It won, hands down. It beat Zaxby's #2 and Popeye's #3. I still haven't had their new chicken sandwich, so I wouldn't be the best judge of that. There's 3-hour lines everywhere you go.
My wife swears, but stop at Athens. No line at the.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Maybe
go
on the way
stop Athens on the way out.
Maybe on the way home. Well, so that was, and this isn't a huge scoop or anything like that, but it was something that kind of helped drive the day in Georgia politics. And so I would rather have that at 6 a.m. this morning than 9 p.m. last night, or 8 p.m. last night, whenever I actually got it. So that's an example, not a huge break, but an example of an embargo. And I tend to like those because it's early in the morning, people wake up, they read it, it helps kind of, set the agenda for that day. But there's also things that are breaking, or they're developing stories that you can't embargo, and they're just right there in front of you. And that's probably 80% of what we do is the breaking stories where there's things. In terms of developing those stories, I understand too that especially with a big announcement, a candidate gets in the race. Raphael Warnock and Doug Collins both got in the Senate race a day apart 2 weeks ago. And how that kind of thing develops is I knew that Doug Collins and Raphael Warnock were running for weeks, right? It was not some super surprise in the Georgia political world. And I've known both of those men for a very long time as well. And I had been bugging Reverend Warnock a lot. And I had told them that I was getting ready to report that he was running. And sometimes he answered me, sometimes he didn't. I also understand that, he didn't have a PR team quite yet, right? He hadn't staffed up, so he wasn't probably sure what to say to me. And at some point, I just gave him a heads up. I was like, I have 4 people who know what their stuff is, who are telling me you're running, so I'm going to inject that into my next story on the Senate race. So I did. And he basically said, no problem there. With Doug Collins, around the day before Warnock got in the race, Doug Collins officially announced. And it was the same situation, although it was a little bit more up in the air. And I had heard from a lot of people that the announcement was coming soon, and then it was a Monday before he got in the race. He got in the race Wednesday, but he was coming to the Capitol Tuesday, and I was like, well, guys, I'm hearing from a tremendous amount of people that he's ready for announcement, and I talked with folks all around the decision who are familiar with the decision, and got enough that my editor was good with me to go for the story. So sometimes it evolves like that. A lot of times it's hustle, it's grinding, it's talking to these people, it's bugging them. Sometimes it's simply telling them that what's up, right? This is not a big one, but Bloomberg gave $5 million to Stacey Abrams and came to speak at one of her events. And it's very sensitive for Stacey Abrams, right? This was even before a lot of the incendiary remarks that Mike Bloomberg made had come out. This was a couple weeks ago. But it's a very touchy situation for her. So I told her folks that I knew he was coming and that I had all the goods to report. And they basically said, can we have a few minutes to discuss this? I said, sure, of course. And ended up going on the record. And so there's situations like that too. What I try to live by, and you can't always do it, but is the no surprises, where I try to keep either the candidate themselves or the official themselves, or if they have a PR team, their PR team, in the loop about what I'm working on. I try not to completely sandbag them. There are situations where it's out of your control, right? Where different things happen and you just got to write the story as quickly as possible because it's breaking and whatever. But 99.9% of the time, there's enough time to have that discussion with candidates. And sometimes it's 5 minutes, right? Sometimes it's a text to Johnny Isaacson's chief spokeswoman saying, I know he just told his staff that he's resigning. I'm about to report the story, right? Sometimes it's like that, where you're just like, it is the biggest story in Georgia that month, and you've got to press that button as quick as you can and load up the laptop. So sometimes it's that.
Let me ask you a final question. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Russell here in the audience. Do you ever think it's a good idea to actually say no comment for a public official?
I understand why they don't, but I would always comment. And I just would.
Is there a better way to get the concept? Because I was always trained to say, I don't have anything for you. There's nothing new here, or something like that.
Yeah.
Because that's less likely to be reported on than saying, Watson said no comment.
Exactly.
When asked about if he did X, Y, and Z, Watson said no comment, and then it just.
That's kind of what I do. I say, we're
Yeah.
focused on our campaign.
Yeah.
We're focused on
something.
supporting, if you're a Republican, supporting President Trump's agenda. If you're a Democrat, fighting President Trump's agenda, whatever it be. And we're not going to be drawn into the daily battle. And that actually happened. There's always an example, but that actually happened. There was this, we were talking about it before, there was this I wrote a story about how, minor story, but sometimes as reporters you have to remember that even the most minor stories can end up blowing up. But Kelly Leffler had an ad, she's the new Georgia senator, she had an ad holding a gun and wearing like a hunting vest and camo. Turns out she doesn't have a hunting license. So I gave her folks the heads up that I was working on the story, and they needed a little bit of time to think about it, and it was fine because it wasn't a breaking story. But they decided not to comment, and they had all sorts of things off the record to say, which is fine, but no comment, and so I put the no comment in there. And right after I wrote the story, it did not come from Doug Collins' campaign. The source it came from actually went on the record. That's why I can say that. It came from a left-leaning outfit out there. But Doug Collins ran a digital ad, like attacking her and making fun of the wardrobe she was wearing and how she wore. I guess they purport that she's wearing a $30 hunting vest, but a $1,000 like fancy belt buckle.
Don't wear a Chanel belt.
Yeah, it was something.
Or LV.
Yeah.
Either is not good for
So
her.
they were making fun of her hunting attire, and and there's a big fat no comment in there. So to me, I would always at least say something, and it doesn't mean I'll necessarily use it as a reporter. I'm not going to use like some big propaganda chunk in every story, but at least you gave me something.
I mean, one of the distinctions, you teased this up earlier about this, and we're talking specifically about these kinds of conversations in a public affairs, in a political context, is what you touched on earlier, which is opposition. I mean, there's always opposition. So if you're talking to someone and they're saying one thing about this ad, there's another side saying something else and trying to shape a different narrative. And so you often have different vying sides, and that's what makes it different.
Yeah.
If you're putting out something about, a new cookie that's coming on the market or something like that, unless you have a very virulent competitor in the marketplace, it's unlikely that you're competing in that space in the same way you are in a public
politics,
affair.
yeah. And it's weird because we as reporters are in the middle, and we're the only ones who really know where the stuff is coming, right? Like, let's say this is, again, I'll use that weird example of the hunting license thing. Like when I called, I can give them a heads up, but I am under no requirement to tell them where I got the info, whether it's from me, and I wish I had thought of filing an open records request for the hunting, right? But I didn't. But whether it's from me, whether it's from her Republican opponents, whether it's from her Democratic opponents, whether it's from random, a random source out there, a student, whoever, who thought to do something that I didn't think to do. So when I called up Kelly Leffler's campaign, they probably thought, I didn't ask them, but they probably thought it came from Doug Collins, right? And then when I wrote the story, I get a call. One of the people I talk to every day is one of the people from the Doug Collins campaign, from one of Doug Collins' aides saying, "I wish I had thought of that. Darn it! I can't believe they thought about it before I did." So it's just funny. And again, nothing that will. I've had stories that have changed races and all that. This is not one that will change a race, but something that is super, super. Just a little back and forth that helps change maybe the public perception of the senator.
Dr. Russell.
Yeah.
Students, what do you want to know? They're being shy, so I'll ask Professor Watson. I wanted to ask you real quick. We talked about this earlier.
Okay.
The relevance to PR students that are not going into politics.
Yeah, I like to use the Talladega Nights analogy, which is like it's like driving with the cougar. You know what I mean? If you could do comms in a public affairs context and report in this context, the alternative is easier because there's so much going on. There's so much kind of jeopardy that's involved. But I think the skill set is the same. I mean, the same principles that go into how you manage a political candidate or you manage a public official is the same as it would be the case if you were managing the head of a nonprofit or the CEO of an organization. The principles are largely the same. It's just the context that's different, and it's the level of overhang of opposition that makes it a little bit different. But the best practices are the same. I mean, I've pitched exclusives and pitched embargoed pieces both for issue advocacy campaigns on behalf of a private client as well as the same information working for a U.S. senator, or a Senate candidate. So it's really the same stuff, and it's the same rules that apply, and you need to be conversant on that. And the expectation as a public relations practitioner is that you're the person that knows that. If you're the comms person, you're expected to know that. The CEO may know it, but there's no expectation that he or she knows it, and so it's for you to step in and say, CEO Mary, we're going to have a conversation with Greg this morning, and here's what we are willing to say, here's what we don't want to get into, here's what he's going to try and ask you, and you need to prep. But that same prep would go into preparing a candidate for a conversation like that, as well as a CEO or anyone else you'd work with.
And that reminds me, too, my favorite question to ask after an end of the interview is, what should I have asked? Mm-hmm. What did you, and because you never know as a reporter what you're going to get from that question, because you might have prepped your CEO, your candidate for 15 different things, and I might have asked all 15 of them, but when given the space to talk about whatever they want, some of the most interesting things comes out.
Well, and I think what's also interesting, I was thinking about, there are always, and I'm curious your take on these things, the kind of like the quiz or the gotcha moments. There was, during the Democratic primary recently, they asked, I think, Klobuchar and Steyer and Mayor Pete were all asked to name the president of Mexico. And Klobuchar and Steyer couldn't come up with a name. You know what I mean? And it's the same thing that kind of has vexed people where you say, do you know whatever? And you don't. Prep is very important. And some journalists, that's more interesting to them than others, but I always find that interesting to see that. And you always see a story off.
Yeah, and like as a reporter, you risk going overboard on that kind of thing. But to me, and something that I always tell like red and black writers, that I learned a hard lesson here is know your audience. And I was here during 9/11, and I was obsessed with international relations and what was happening in the globe. And so every day for the red and black, I wrote a story that that CNN could have written. Not as good as CNN could have written, but CNN or New York Times could have written about what was going on in the world around September 11th. And it might quote a few UGA poli-sci professors and things like that, but it was mostly a national story. And then I had the late, great Conrad Fink pull me aside and he goes, Bluestein, who are you writing for? He used to talk in that gruff voice. And I'd say, well, I'm writing for, I was kind of writing for me because I was so obsessed with that thing. And he goes, remember your audience. And, my audience in the Red and Black was the university community and maybe some alumni who were reading the Red and Black to get to know to have a connection to what was happening on campus. My audience now is Metro Atlanta, statewide audience who's really involved and really interested in Georgia politics. But I'm also not writing for New York, and I'm not writing for a global audience like I was necessarily at the Associated Press where I used to work, or if I was working at CNN, which has a completely different audience. And so my questions are usually tailored to that. Like when I'm interviewing a CEO or a candidate or whatever, my focus will be completely different than, let's say, a Wall Street Journal reporter. So as PR professionals, you have to know that too, that what the reporter you're talking to will have a completely different, depending on what publication they work for, will have a different angle. The Marietta Daily Journal has a very different view of things than the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, right? And just like the Associated Press would have a different take than a niche publication like Market Watch that focuses on how the markets are moving.
Absolutely. Dr. Haynes.
Well, and then Carter. I'm probably reading first. So you mentioned audience, and so for our media and politics class, one thing that we're interested in is how news organizations, we know that you work in PR, I work in PR,
Yeah.
polarization and growing an audience in that way, or trying to be as unbiased as possible and keeping that AP style, this is the news, not framing it in any way that someone will like more than the other.
There's a total danger in that. And like, honestly, from my perspective, it's why I, about a year or two ago, stopped looking but I stopped looking at the click counts of the day. And I stopped looking at those metrics, that how many how clicks this or that story got, because I started feeling that it had even if I didn't want to admit it, it had an effect on what types of stories I was writing, because it changes the way you look at headlines and changes the focus. In 2016, every single time I mentioned President Trump, or Donald Trump, it was before he was president, Donald Trump in a headline, like the story would just go nuts. And 2017, same thing, right? He was the new president, and every time you mentioned, you wrote about a tweet he wrote about, the story would go crazy. But I started taking a step back and realizing, as much as I was still covering Georgia politics, I was dabbling and writing about whatever Trump was doing, but it wasn't serving my audience at all. It might be getting 50,000, 100,000, 300,000 clicks, whatever it was that day. But it wasn't serving our audience, because our audience isn't coming. There's 50,000 reporters in Washington who cover Trump, literally. Tens of thousands of reporters in Washington right now who cover everything the president does and everything the White House is doing. But there's like a very small group of reporters in the Atlanta State House who actually cover what's happening under the Gold Dome, and even fewer who actually are covering politics in Georgia. And so I kind of completely shifted. And I still cover, I still went to New Hampshire last week and Iowa the week before that, and I'll be in South Carolina. So I still cover those big events, but try to do it as much as I can through a Georgia lens, to talk about how the South Carolina race, it's easy to do this, but how the South Carolina race will relate to Georgia, because the Democratic electorates in both those states are so similar. But there's a total danger in doing that. And same thing with niche things, Every time we write about, let's say, the teacher retirement system, which is a hugely important issue, it goes nuts on the teacher retirement blogs and the Facebook sites and all that. And it's a very important part of the state budget and all that. So I'm not saying we don't cover it, but we also can't devote someone to it full time, even though every time we write about it, it goes haywire, because it still affects a more niche group of our readers.
Mr. Chapman.
Yeah.
So at the start of the talk, you mentioned that there was like maybe 2% of PR people that you would just have to burn because they had like committed unforgivable sins. Without getting into specifics, what are some of the unforgivable sins that you could commit as a PR person that you would just have to burn that bridge?
Good question. I was wondering if this would come back. And I'm prepared to talk about it. I won't name names, but lying. And there was a situation in 2018 with a candidate who was just not doing well in the polls and desperate to get any sort of traction. And they decided that they would get traction by attacking us, which is fine, because it's not the first, from the president on down, a lot of Republican candidates, and some Democrats too, attack the media, so that's fine. But when you cross that line, and they crossed the line, they had a conversation, one of this candidate's aides had a conversation with one of my colleagues, and my colleague told the candidate, they were accusing my colleague of bias, and my colleague told them, I'm not biased, I'm biased for the truth. That candidate proceeded to run digital ads saying, Jim Galloway, that's my colleague, I gave it away. Jim Galloway admits he's biased against said candidate. And at that point, I was like, give me a break. Guy was in last place in the polls. I'm like, I don't need to, this is ridiculous. And of course, I talked with my editors about it and told them, it doesn't mean I completely stopped interacting, because there was still a week or two left to go in the campaign, so there were certain things but everything at that point on was in writing, and I had as little to do with them as possible, because I knew that they were unscrupulous. And once you have that, and it takes a lot to get there, but once you get there, there's no coming back, in my book.
And I would just add that the flip side of that's also true, because the PR practitioner, you also have to decide, if they're journalists, that you say, I'm not gonna deal with this person anymore. And I think in that instance, it does matter whether you are doing it for a private party versus a public party. It's a different standard there, and I think you get into all the drama over the current administration treatment of White House press corps and stuff like that. But if you're working for a private client, I had a journalist I was working, we had to work with when I was working for a private client, and the journalist committed what to me is the cardinal sin, and that is they bled the lines between news reporting and editorializing, and they just bled them, and the pieces would be mixtures of factual information, mixtures of opinion, content that were not substantiated or not according to a source, but just the reporter was attributing it to themselves. And I just said, I'm not gonna burn my time talking to a journalist and feeding them information and spending a day drafting statements, prepping people, and they're gonna write a bad piece that's full of editorial content anyway, and it's not going to be a news article. And I think as a PR practitioner, you have to decide that too. Depends on the publication, depends on the state. There are a lot of variables you have to think about in that. But there comes a time when there can be diminishing returns from that kind of engagement. You can go to the editor. There are a lot of things you can do, but sometimes you can do all that and still not work out, and you got to say, I'm done with that too.
We are not infallible, right? And we have to remember that. And I've seen reporters do the same thing. And it's incumbent on us reporters if we screw something up, because it happens, right? Last year I wrote this big story about how Governor Deal, right before he left office, gave a lot of his top deputies these golden parachutes. Basically gave them like 2-year contracts or 3-year contracts that would give them giant payouts if Brian Kemp wanted to replace them, or whoever. At that point, we didn't know if it was going to be Kemp or Abrams, but whoever the next governor was, if they wanted to replace, say, the lottery chief or whoever. So big front page story. Went over my documents meticulously, checked everything that I thought at least I checked everything a couple times, but I had one agency head in there wrongly. And the story was out online, and I guess the agency heads hadn't seen it, and the FLAC hadn't seen it until it published the next day. But boy, were they upset, and I completely get it. And so I said, look, I'm going to correct this as soon as possible. I'm going to issue a correction in the print paper. I'm going to issue a correction digitally. And they were really worried about what Governor Kemp would think. And I said, I'll let Governor Kemp's folks know that this is wrong too. I have no problem doing that. Just giving an FYI, hey, text, in a text like, hey, I screwed this part up. But in this case, I also said, because this guy's job was on the line, and I get it. And this is a PR someone I've worked with for 15 years too. I said, I'll talk to your boss and tell him the truth, which was it's on me.
Yeah,
he gave me the right information. I messed it. I put it wrongly in the spreadsheet or something. I can't even remember exactly what happened, but I screwed it up. And so that happens too. And we get in trouble if we insist that we were right, or what. In this case, it was super clear that I was wrong. And 99.9% of that story was right. It was great. It was a fun front page story. It was nice, interesting watchdog piece. But boy, I still remember that. When I think back on that story, I don't think about how fun the story. I think I can't believe that I messed up that fact. And at least I'm glad that they pointed out to me as quickly as they saw it, and that we got it corrected. And then I went and got on a conference call with his boss and was like, yeah, your guy didn't lead me down the wrong way. It was me. So it's a hard conversation to have. You hate to have it, but it happens.
You're a good man. Dr. Middleton.
If a student has one, I'll hold them and fold them. Student, you got one? One will be after that.
So as I know you mentioned the 2018 governor's race and then the Kelly Leffler ad, and so as far as campaign branding and how campaigns try to create a persona that may not be really who they are, how does the media play into that? Whether it's bolstering that persona or either denying it, and how does that affect their campaign?
Yeah, we're seeing it in real time right now with Kelly Leffler. She is a multi-millionaire who owns a Buckhead estate, who is married to one of the richest guys in Atlanta. Her company owns the New York Stock Exchange. So big, huge financial powerhouse. And she's running as a pro-Trump Republican, focusing on her rural upbringing in Illinois, which is all true. She grew up in a soybean farm in Illinois. But it's going to be really interesting to see how they try to navigate that. And from our perspective, we tell what's happening, right? So on the one hand, we can say that all her ads are focused on President Trump and on her, how she used to show, I think it was show horses, and she was involved in the 4-H club and all this, fun stuff from her childhood. But she lives in a house that was, I think it's $11 million. It was one of the most expensive home purchases in Atlanta history, right? And so there's going to be a divide. And luckily, honestly, for us, we have folks attacking her on that issue too. So sometimes you're out there alone writing about this stuff, but other times you have voices in those stories. And so if you're Doug Collins' campaign and you're ticked off that you weren't appointed by Brian Kemp, and you say you're the true conservative, what do? You try to paint her every step of the way as out of touch with average Georgians. And so that's why you saw them do that digital ad yesterday about the hunting license and all that. And so our job is kind of to navigate that. We can say what she's saying, but we can also, on the campaign trail, but we also have to point out that, hey, we wrote a big Sunday story 2 weeks ago about how every single vote that Kelly Leffler has might have some, not every single vote, but a lot of the votes she has might have implications on her own bottom line because they involve financial regulations and things like that. So there's a lot of tricky balancing we do as reporters.
I would just add to that, from the public relations side, there's the classic Shakespeare quote, "To thine own self be true." And I always say that because, it's always going to be better to run as yourself. You're going to emphasize certain things, but I joke that if I ran for office and somebody saw me racking a shotgun in camo, they would just spit their drink out laughing because anybody who knows me knows that that's not me. I don't own any camo. That's not me. And so you can't run a campaign creating a brand that is not you and think it's going to be sustainable and think that your opposition is going to just let you walk through a field of flowers pretending to be someone that you're not. You have to embrace who you are in your story and utilize that to your advantage. If you're a very wealthy person, that's part of your story. Like Mike Bloomberg's running a campaign now where he's not hiding from the fact that he's a multi-billionaire. He's using it as a competitive advantage to say, well, this is why I'm the better candidate to take on Trump because I can spend, tens of millions of dollars or whatever, hundreds of millions of dollars in my ads. So it's not about, and that's the challenge. People think, and again, I think it's to a certain extent, it's looking down upon your audience. It's kind of thinking you can pull one over on your audience, and people are really too smart to do that. You have to really craft something that's sincere and true that's going to be persuasive and resonate. But I've seen too many campaigns where people try to portray themselves in a fashion that's not true to themselves, and it rarely works.
That's why the 2018 campaign here was so fun for me in that sense, at least. A lot of it wasn't fun. But because Brian Kemp and Stacey Abrams, whether you voted for them or supported them or liked them or not, they were authentic to themselves. Anyone who knew Brian Kemp 30 years ago, and your dean of Grady did, would probably tell you that he's the same Brian Kemp that he saw in those ads. That's truly Brian Kemp.
And the house in the ad is his house. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You couldn't go back and say when the Oppo research said, well,
you rented out a mansion.
You rented out whatever. And it's like, no, that's really his property.
And same thing with Stacey. Stacey Abrams, she was not running away from her views on those issues and on the issues that she embraced. And it was, to me, honestly refreshing to see both candidates who were as authentic as they could to be to themselves running on their issues.
Yeah, I always say it's better to lose as yourself than better to lose as yourself than win as someone else.
Yeah.
Okay, 3 more things before we go. Number 1, Parker.
Hello, thank you both, and thanks to everybody for letting me come sit in. But if you want more politics or media, come back next week, Tuesday at 11:30 or 12 for more lunch, and you'll hear from Professor Watson, joined by Amy Robach, Devin Norval, and Dean Davis, and Brian Robinson.
Wow, I'm the warm-up act.
What do we owe our audiences as from public affairs, communications, and journalism in this election year? And so thank you so much. And my question was going to be, what do you do when that cougar's in the car with you all the time? Try to keep him fed, but we'll talk about that.
That's your,
Bring a lot of meat, Parker. Yeah. Bring a lot of meat with you.
Number 2, students in my class need to come and sign out before you leave. Number 3, there's food in the back for everyone. Help yourself, fruit sandwiches and chips. And before you go attack the food, please, and sign out with Dr. Haynes too. Please give them a big hand for.
That's awesome.